Thursday, April 22nd, 1915. 5 o'clock in the evening. Langemarck, Belgian Flanders. The wind changed direction at 1700 hours on the 22nd of April, 1915, and with it came a fog that smelled like pineapples and pepper. French colonial troops from Algeria, dug into trenches north of Ypres in Belgian Flanders, watched the yellow-green cloud roll toward them across no man's land like a living thing, hugging the ground, filling every crater and fold in the earth. Some men laughed. Others pointed. A few raised their rifles, as if bullets could stop what was coming. Within 3 minutes, 4,000 soldiers were clawing at their throats, vomiting blood, and drowning in their own lungs while standing upright in the open air. They had no word for what was killing them, no doctrine, no defense. The Germans had opened a valve on 6,000 steel cylinders containing 168 tons of liquefied chlorine gas, and in doing so, they had rewritten the rules of human warfare. The cloud moved at walking speed. The screaming could be heard for miles. This was not the first use of poison in war. Humanity had been contaminating wells and coating arrows with venom since before written history. But this was different. This was industrial. This was chemistry harnessed to the same engines of mass production that stamped out shells and wove barbed wire. This was the moment when war stopped being a contest between men and became a contest between laboratories. And it began, as so many transformations do, with disbelief. The spring of 1915 found the Western Front locked in a paralysis so complete that it had become its own kind of madness. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, two vast armies faced each other across a scar of mud and wire that refused to move. The German attack through Belgium had stalled. The French counteroffensives had failed. The British Expeditionary Force, once a professional instrument of imperial power, had been bled white at Ypres the previous autumn, and now clung to a bulge in the line around that shattered medieval city with grim determination. Hundreds of thousands of men lived in ditches, separated by distances measured in yards, killing each other with rifles and artillery in exchanges that produced casualty lists longer than the gains they achieved. The front had become a place where motion itself seemed to have died. In this static nightmare, both sides searched desperately for an advantage. The French experimented with rifle grenades filled with tear gas, small xylyl bromide cartridges that irritated eyes but killed no one. The Germans used similar devices, firing shells filled with irritants at Russian positions on the Eastern Front in January. These were nuisances, temporary inconveniences. The Hague Convention of 1899 had prohibited the use of projectiles whose sole purpose was to distribute poison or asphyxiating gas, and both sides told themselves they were adhering to the spirit, if not the letter, of this agreement. These were not poisons. These were irritants. Technicalities mattered in 1915. They mattered right up until the moment they stopped mattering at all. The German Chemical Warfare Service, established in late 1914 under the direction of Fritz Haber, saw things differently. Haber was a chemist of international reputation, a man who had already revolutionized agriculture by synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen, a process that would eventually feed billions. He was also a German patriot who believed that science had no neutrality, that knowledge was a weapon like any other, and that his country's survival demanded its use. When the Kaiser's generals came to him seeking a way to break the deadlock in the West, Haber proposed something audacious. Not shells filled with irritants, which scattered their contents inefficiently and could be blamed on the winds of war, but a deliberate, calculated release of pure industrial chlorine on a scale never attempted. Chlorine was cheap. Germany produced thousands of tons of it annually for dye manufacturing. It was heavier than air, which meant it would sink into trenches rather than dissipate, and it was unambiguously lethal. The German High Command hesitated. Releasing gas from cylinders was not the same as firing a shell that happened to contain chemicals. This was intentional. This was crossing a line that, once crossed, might invite retaliation in kind. But Haber argued with the confidence of a man who believed himself on the right side of history. The war was killing thousands every day. Gas might end it faster. Gas might save lives in the aggregate by making the current slaughter obsolete. It was a logic that would echo through the 20th century in countless forms, the mathematics of atrocity dressed in the language of efficiency. The generals agreed. They would try it at Ypres, where the British and French lines met, where a breakthrough might roll up the entire Allied position and finally, after months of stagnation, restore the war to movement. The preparations took weeks. German engineers installed 6,000 metal cylinders along a 4-mile section of front opposite the village of Langemarck, north of Ypres. Each cylinder stood 4 feet tall and weighed 90 pounds when full. They were painted grey-green and stenciled with warnings in German. Crews connected them to pipes and valves, burying the apparatus in the forward trenches where it would be invisible to Allied observation. The work was dangerous. Chlorine leaked. Men coughed and choked during installation. A few died. But by mid-April the system was ready. All it needed was the right wind. Across no man's land, the Allies knew nothing. French intelligence had captured German prisoners who spoke of new weapons, of strange cylinders being moved to the front, of respirators being issued to assault troops. These reports filtered up through the chain of command and were promptly dismissed. Gas as a strategic weapon seemed absurd. It was the stuff of science fiction, of H.G. Wells' novels, not modern war. A German deserter crossed the lines on the 15th of April and told his interrogators that a gas attack was imminent, that the cylinders held asphyxiating chlorine, that it would be released when the wind blew from the northeast. The French forwarded this intelligence to British headquarters. The British forwarded it to the French and Canadian commanders holding the northern sector. Everyone read it. No one believed it. Or rather, everyone believed it was possible but thought it unlikely, which in military terms is the same as not believing at all. Canadian physician and Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, serving with an artillery brigade near Ypres, wrote to a friend that the spring landscape was almost beautiful when one ignored the shell craters. Poppies were beginning to bloom in the disturbed earth. The weather was warming. Men talked about the possibility of leave, of seeing England or France beyond the salient. There was no sense of impending apocalypse. There was only the usual low-grade dread of trench warfare, the knowledge that death might arrive from a sniper's bullet or a random shell, but that most days one simply endured. The soldiers in the line that April were a mixture of British regular troops, Canadian volunteers, and French colonial units from Algeria and Morocco. They had survived the winter. They had survived the First Battle of Ypres the previous autumn, when the Germans nearly broke through to the Channel ports. They considered themselves veterans. They had seen everything. They had seen nothing. The wind finally turned on the afternoon of the 22nd. It came from the northeast, steady and cool, blowing directly from the German lines toward the Allied trenches. At 16:50 hours, German artillery began a bombardment of the French positions north of Ypres. This was routine. Both sides shelled each other daily. The French soldiers ducked into their dugouts and waited for it to pass. At 1700 hours, the shelling intensified, concentrating on the villages behind the front line. And then, along a 4-mile stretch between Langemarck and Poelcapelle, German engineers opened the valves on 6,000 cylinders simultaneously. The chlorine came out as a liquid under pressure, vaporizing instantly upon contact with air. It formed a cloud 30 feet high and 4 miles wide, yellow-green in color, dense enough to obscure the ground behind it. It moved at approximately 4 miles per hour, the speed of a leisurely walk, driven by the steady northeast wind. The German soldiers who released it wore primitive respirators, cotton pads soaked in sodium hyposulfite solution and tied over their mouths. They watched the cloud drift away from their trenches with expressions of fascination and horror. Some accounts claim they cheered. Others suggest they stood in silence. The truth is probably both. Men contain multitudes, especially in war. The gas reached the French colonial trenches at 1710. The Algerian and Moroccan troops saw it coming and had approximately 1 minute to make sense of what they were seeing. It looked like fog. It smelled strange, sweet and sharp at once, like a mixture of pineapple and chlorine bleach. Some men held their ground, assuming it was a smokescreen preceding an infantry assault. Others began to run. Within seconds of the cloud's arrival, the choice became irrelevant. Chlorine is a halogen element, highly reactive, eager to bond with organic tissue. When inhaled, it reacts with the moisture in the lungs to produce hydrochloric acid. The human body's response to this insult is immediate and catastrophic. The lungs fill with fluid, an attempt to dilute the acid. The victim effectively drowns in their own secretions. Breathing becomes agony. Coughing brings up pink froth that turns to yellow-white foam. The eyes burn and swell shut. The skin blisters where the gas makes contact. Concentration determines outcome. In low doses, chlorine causes choking and temporary blindness. In high doses, it kills in minutes. The French colonial troops received high doses. 4,000 men were engulfed in the first wave. They staggered out of the trenches, hands clutching their throats, faces turning purple-black from asphyxiation. They vomited. They convulsed. They fell and did not rise. Those who could still move ran, spreading panic back through the support lines. Accounts from survivors, recorded later in field hospitals, speak of absolute chaos. Men trampling each other, men throwing away their rifles and equipment to run faster, men collapsing mid-stride and thrashing on the ground until they stopped moving. The gas cloud continued forward, drifting through the abandoned trenches, rolling over the bodies of those too injured or too dead to flee, pushing deeper into the Allied position. Behind the gas came the German infantry. 4 divisions of the 26th Reserve Corps advanced into the cloud's wake, wearing their respirators, bayonets fixed, moving cautiously into what had been, 10 minutes earlier, a fortified enemy position. They found no resistance. They found only bodies and men too injured to fight. The French colonial line had simply ceased to exist. A gap 4 miles wide had opened in the Allied defences north of Ypres. The road to the city, to the channel ports beyond, lay open. On the flanks of the gas attack, where the chlorine cloud thinned and dissipated, Allied troops finally grasped what was happening. Canadian units holding positions adjacent to the French watched the yellow-green fog roll past and saw their allies stumbling out of it, choking and dying. The Canadians had no gas masks. No one did. But they had urine and handkerchiefs and a desperate, improvised ingenuity born of terror. Orders went out, passed by shouting from trench to trench. Urinate on cloth. Hold it over your face. The ammonia in urine partially neutralizes chlorine. It was crude chemistry, battlefield science conducted in real time with lives hanging on the outcome. It worked, barely. The Canadians soaked rags and pressed them to their mouths, holding positions on the edge of the gas cloud while their eyes streamed and their throats burned. The German advance stalled not because they met resistance, but because they did not believe their own success. The troops moving forward through the gap expected counterattacks, reserves, machine gun nests hidden in the ruins. They found open ground, but doctrine and caution prevailed. The advance halted at nightfall, consolidating gains rather than pushing forward. It was one of the great hesitations of the war. The Germans had achieved complete surprise, had opened a breach that could have collapsed the entire Ypres salient, and they stopped. Partly this was due to lack of reserves. The High Command had not truly believed the gas would work, and had committed insufficient troops to exploit a breakthrough. Partly it was the gas itself. Moving through a poisoned landscape, even with respirators, even knowing the enemy was beaten, induced a psychological caution that numbers alone do not convey. By the 23rd of April, Allied reinforcements were rushing into the gap. Canadian and British brigades counterattacked, not to regain ground but to plug the hole, to restore a continuous line. They advanced through terrain littered with French colonial dead, bodies swollen and discolored, faces frozen in expressions of agony. The smell of chlorine hung in the low ground for days. Artillery continued without pause. And then, on the 24th, the Germans released gas again. This time the wind was less reliable. The cloud drifted unevenly, sometimes back toward German lines, sometimes dissipating before reaching the enemy. But the terror was just as effective. The Canadians, holding positions at Street, Julian and Kitchener's Wood, endured 2 more gas attacks over the following week, each one accompanied by heavy shelling and infantry assaults. They held, paying for every yard in blood. By the end of the Second Battle of Ypres in late May, Canadian forces had suffered 6,000 casualties. French colonial losses were never precisely tallied, but estimates suggest at least 2,000 dead in the initial gas attack alone, with thousands more injured, many of whom would die later from respiratory complications. The gas changed everything and nothing. It changed the nature of fear, introducing a weapon that could kill invisibly, that turned air itself into an enemy. It changed logistics, forcing both sides to develop and distribute protective equipment to millions of soldiers. But it did not change the strategic deadlock. The front barely moved. Ypres remained in Allied hands. The war ground on. Fritz Haber watched the reports from Ypres with satisfaction. The chlorine attack had worked exactly as his calculations predicted. It had broken a fortified line that conventional artillery could not touch. It had vindicated his theories about the military application of industrial chemistry. It had also made him one of the most controversial figures in Germany. Some praised him as a patriot who had given the fatherland a decisive advantage. Others, including some within the scientific community, condemned him as a war criminal who had violated the fundamental ethics of science. Haber's response was coldly utilitarian. War was already a crime, he argued. Gas simply made it more efficient. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, herself a chemist and one of the first women to earn a doctorate in Germany, disagreed violently. She had opposed his work on chemical weapons from the beginning, viewing it as a perversion of everything science should represent. On the 2nd of May, 1915, 10 days after the first gas attack at Ypres, Clara Immerwahr shot herself in the heart with Fritz Haber's service pistol in the garden of their home in Berlin. She died in the arms of their 13-year-old son. Haber left for the Eastern Front the next morning to oversee gas operations against the Russians. He would later say he had no time for mourning. The war demanded his attention. The British and French response to Ypres was immediate and practical. If Germany would use gas, then the Allies would use gas. The moral objections that might have prevented retaliation evaporated in the face of German precedent. British chemists began work on their own gas weapons in May. French factories ramped up production of chlorine. By September of 1915, the British launched their first gas attack at Loos, releasing 150 tons of chlorine from cylinders along a 6-mile front. The wind was wrong. Much of the gas drifted back into British lines, causing nearly as many casualties among the attackers as among the Germans. It did not matter. The threshold had been crossed. Gas was now a standard weapon. The development accelerated with industrial speed. Chlorine was effective but limited. It dispersed quickly. It could be detected by smell and color. Soldiers learned to climb onto the fire step of trenches when gas approached, getting their heads above the cloud's heaviest concentration. So chemists developed phosgene, a colorless gas that smelled faintly of moldy hay, far more toxic than chlorine and harder to detect. The Germans deployed it in December 1915. Then came diphosgene, an even more stable variant. Then chloropicrin, a powerful irritant that forced soldiers to remove their gas masks, leaving them vulnerable to subsequent poison gas. The arsenal of chemistry was opening, and every month brought new variations. By 1917, The nature of gas warfare had evolved again. The Germans introduced mustard gas, sulfur mustard, a substance so insidious it rendered the battlefield itself uninhabitable. Mustard gas did not need to be inhaled to kill. It burned through clothing, blistered skin on contact, and caused blindness even in low concentrations. It persisted in the environment for days or weeks, contaminating trenches and equipment. It forced armies to abandon positions not because they had been overrun, but because they had been poisoned. More than 88,000 men died from gas during the First World War. More than 1 million were injured, many of them permanently. Gas masks became universal equipment. Training in chemical defense became mandatory. Entire factories were converted to produce respirators, protective clothing, and detection equipment. The mask itself became an icon of the war. Early versions were little more than cloth bags soaked in chemical neutralizers, tied over the head with eyepieces made from mica or glass. They were hot, claustrophobic, and only marginally effective. Later, models used charcoal filters and rubber face pieces, creating a sealed system that protected against most agents but made breathing labored and vision restricted. Soldiers slept with masks within reach. Horses and mules were fitted with specialized respirators. Guard dogs received them. Carrier pigeons did not, which created problems for military communications. The entire Western Front became a place where breathable air could not be assumed, where survival required technology as much as courage. The strategic impact of gas, however, remained ambiguous. It caused horrific casualties, but so did artillery, machine guns, and rifles. It introduced terror, but war is always terror. It never produced the decisive breakthrough that Haber and others had envisioned. Masks and doctrine neutralized much of its effectiveness. Winds remained unpredictable. Gas shells, introduced to replace unreliable cylinders, diluted concentration. By 1918, gas accounted for less than 3% of total casualties on the Western Front, despite accounting for nearly 30% of all munitions fired in some sectors. It had become just another method of industrial killing, one more item on a menu of horrors. But the psychological impact endured. Men who survived gas attacks described them differently than conventional wounds. A bullet or shell fragment was comprehensible, a physical object that obeyed physics and could be evaded or treated. Gas was invisible, odorless in its most advanced forms, and it lingered. It killed slowly, over hours or days, drowning men in their own fluids while they remained conscious. Survivors often suffered permanent respiratory damage, chronic bronchitis, and increased susceptibility to tuberculosis. Many developed what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered by smells or weather conditions that reminded them of gas attacks. The British poet Wilfred Owen, himself gassed in 1917, wrote of watching a soldier die after failing to secure his mask in time. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, Owen wrote, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Owen knew better. He died 1 week before the armistice. On the 11th of November, 1918, the guns fell silent. The Western Front, that 440-mile scar across Europe, ceased to pulse with explosions. In the stillness, men emerged from trenches and stared at each other across no man's land, enemies who had been killing each other for 4 years and now simply stopped. The war had consumed 8 million military dead and 21 million wounded. The gas, that innovation introduced at Ypres in April of 1915, had contributed its share. 88,000 dead, 1 million injured. Numbers that sound almost modest in the context of the war's total slaughter, but numbers that represented a threshold crossed. Fritz Haber received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918 for his pre-war work on ammonia synthesis. The award was controversial, Scientists from allied nations boycotted the ceremony, calling him a war criminal. Haber seemed genuinely surprised by the criticism. He had served his country, he said. He had applied science to national need. The fact that the application involved poison seemed to him a detail, a footnote to the larger narrative of duty and innovation. He continued working on chemical weapons in the 1920s, helping Germany evade the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, which banned German production of poison gas. In the 1930s, Haber, who was Jewish, fled Nazi Germany and died in exile in Switzerland in 1934. The Nazis would later use a chemical he helped develop, Zyklon B, in the death camps. History keeps its ironies sharp. The Ypres salient, where gas first changed the nature of warfare, became a place of pilgrimage. Cemeteries spread across the landscape like crops, neat rows of white headstones marking where the dead had been gathered. The Menin Gate in Ypres, a memorial arch completed in 1927, bears the names of 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the salient and have no known grave. Every evening at 8, traffic stops and buglers play the last post, a ritual maintained every single day since the memorial's dedication except during the German occupation in the Second World War. The names carved in stone include men who died from bullets, shells, and gas. The memorial does not distinguish. The dead are the dead. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. It was a response to the horror of the Western Front, an attempt to place limits on the means of killing even as nations continued to build their chemical arsenals. The protocol had no enforcement mechanism. It did not require disarmament. Nations that signed it interpreted the ban narrowly. Gas was forbidden in war, but developing and stockpiling it was permitted. Testing it on one's own soldiers, as all major powers did throughout the 1930s and 40s, was technically legal. The protocol was a symbol, a statement of intent that did nothing to prevent Italy from using mustard gas in Ethiopia in 1935, or Japan from deploying chemical weapons in China throughout the 1930s and 40s, or Egypt from using gas in Yemen in the 1960s. Taboos exist only so long as nations choose to honor them. The 20th century became a catalogue of chemical near misses. Both sides stockpiled gas during the Second World War, enough to kill millions, and neither used it in Europe, restrained partly by fear of retaliation and partly by the memory of 1915. The Cold War saw superpowers develop nerve agents, organophosphates so toxic that a drop on the skin could kill in minutes. VX, sarin, tabun. These were not battlefield weapons. These were weapons of apocalypse, designed to annihilate entire armies or populations. They were produced in vast quantities and never used in major conflicts, locked in bunkers and silos alongside nuclear warheads, symbols of a destructive capacity that exceeded any conceivable military need. The survivors of Ypres grew old, those who had run from the yellow-green cloud, who had pressed urine-soaked rags to their faces, who had watched friends choke to death on spring air, carried the memory with them. Some spoke of it, most did not. By the 1970s and 80s, they were dying of old age, taking their first-hand knowledge of what gas warfare actually felt like into history. The last known veteran of the gas attack at Ypres, a Canadian infantryman named John Babcock, died in 2010 at the age of 109. He had been a teenager in 1915. He remembered the smell. Today, the site where the Germans released 168 tons of chlorine on the 22nd of April, 1915, is farmland again. Fields of wheat and barley grow where trenches once rotted. Farmers occasionally unearth shells and bones, remnants of the war that refused to fully decompose. The earth around Ypres is still contaminated, not with gas but with heavy metals and unexploded ordnance, a toxicity that will persist for centuries. The Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, all the great killing grounds of the Western Front, have returned to agriculture and grazing, but the soil remembers. Crops grow stunted in certain zones. Water wells must be carefully sited. The war poisoned the ground in ways that transcend metaphor. The gas itself, chlorine and phosgene and mustard, has been used since. Syria used it against its own population during the civil war in 2013 and again in subsequent years. Russia has been accused of deploying nerve agents in assassination attempts. Non-state actors have experimented with chemical weapons, seeking force multipliers that do not require conventional military infrastructure. The threshold crossed at Ypres in 1915 has been recrossed repeatedly, each time met with international condemnation, and each time reaffirming that once a weapon exists, it never truly disappears. John McCrae, the Canadian physician who found the spring landscape near Ypres almost beautiful, wrote a poem after the battle, In Flanders Fields. It became one of the most famous pieces of verse produced by the war, recited at memorial services and taught in schools. "We are the dead," McCrae wrote. "Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields." He wrote it sitting on the back of an ambulance between surgeries, surrounded by the wounded and dying, in a landscape where the air itself had become a weapon. McCrae died of pneumonia and meningitis in January of 1918, months before the war ended. He was buried in France. His grave is marked. His name is not on the Menin Gate. The wind that carried the chlorine cloud over Ypres on the 22nd of April, 1915, came from the northeast at a steady 4 miles per hour. It was a spring wind, cool and unremarkable, the kind of breeze that might have scattered poppy seeds or carried the smell of ploughed earth in a different season. Instead, it carried innovation. It carried a future where the distinction between combatant and environment collapsed, where survival required not just courage but the right equipment, the right knowledge, the right mask. The soldiers who stood in their trenches that evening and watched the yellow-green fog approach them had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. They were experiencing the future in real time, and it smelled like pineapples. And then it killed them. And then it spread.